I'm just starting this a couple of minutes early to give everybody time to log into the room. I'm Kristina Perez, and this is World Building 101. So let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay. And we'll just give it a few minutes before getting started. And I've put up a poll for you to start our discussion off with as well. So let me know if you're here, if you send me a little chat. I'll be taking questions throughout the webinar. And I'm just going to start a little presentation. Okay, and start. So you can see the beginning of the presentation. We're just going to wait until a few more people have joined since it's just a few minutes before 5 o'clock. Okay, great. I'm so glad you guys are here. Yeah, let me know where you're from. Oh, Mindy, thank you. I'm so glad you like my books. So there's someone from Puerto Rico, North Carolina, London, Edinburgh. It's so exciting. I usually do this presentation seminar in person. This is my first time with webinar. So if I, kind of stumble a little bit, just bear with me. I am kind of a natural Luddite, which is probably why I write about things mostly medieval. Ooh, we've got somebody from Los Angeles. Yes, I can't wait to come to the States too. I'm originally from New York, and unfortunately, we can't go anywhere at the moment. London has been amazingly sunny since the lockdown began. Let me know how things are in your neck of the woods. Ooh, we've got someone from Sweden as well, Ontario. Very exciting. So how are we doing with the poll? Okay, I've just published it, and I am asking who has started writing a book. Ooh, so far 100%, excellent. Which I guess is why you're all here. Is anybody doing the NaNoWriMo at the moment? Oh, Arizona. Hello, Kimberly from Arizona. My parents live in Arizona, actually. So it's just about 2 minutes to 5, and I will sort of start the proper presentation at 5. So let's see, how are we doing with the poll? 94% have started writing a book now. That's a good percentage. Yes, so how are people doing with the writing during this time? Probably a little bit tougher than usual. And okay, we are going to start. Hopefully you can see me. And you can also see my slides. So it's now just about 5 o'clock on the dot, and I will start by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know, I am Kristina Perez. I am the author of the Sweet Black Waves trilogy and also of the Tez Legacy. The Sweet Black Waves trilogy is a YA fantasy that is a retelling of the medieval legend of Tristan and Isolde. And the Tez Legacy is a YA contemporary sci-fi that is about a girl developing superpowers in New York City. So they're quite far apart in terms of their world building, but they still have the same basic structure and commonalities, which is what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today. So I see that 95% of you have started writing a book, and I'm going to ask you in another poll now, are you writing fantasy or sci-fi or something else? Aha, so far 100% fantasy. Ooh, no, it's changing now. We've got a little more even mix, so 27% sci-fi. Okay, so basically, I think you guys are all in the right place, I hope. And I'm also, I should have mentioned, I'm also a literary agent at the Zeno Agency here in London, which specializes in sci-fi and fantasy. I'm representing adult, YA, and also romance and nonfiction. So when you have your queries ready, please do query me. I'm open to submissions. So now I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible using the polls and also the chat while I'm doing the slide presentation. So I'll try to get to all of your questions at the end of each slide. And if I don't, then ask me the question again, and hopefully it will come up in the box. So the beginning of world building that I want to talk to you about is, who here knows your Hogwarts house? 100%, which is, oh no, okay. It's shifting. Well, at least half of you do. And that is actually kind of what I would expect, because the Harry Potter universe is so pervasive in popular culture, Western culture, all over the world, actually, at this point. And that's an example of world building that really works, because you know what it is. People feel very strongly, in fact, about whether they're a Slytherin or a Ravenclaw or a Gryffindor. Now you can tell me in the chat which one you are if you'd like. You can also take a guess at which I am. So in addition to Hogwarts, obviously I have the image from the Hunger Games movie out here. So I'm publishing another poll. How many districts are there in Panem? 15, 11, or this is a trick question because spoilers. 11. 100? Yes, 66%. This is a trick question because spoilers. But the fact that most people know that there are 12 districts when the series starts, and then we discover a 13th district, is another example of really great world building. And the fact that the author did her job in letting us know all the rules that we need, and the geography, and how the different districts come into conflict with each other, what their different attributes are, whether they're an agricultural district or a mining district. All of these details are what makes her world so rich, and what makes people sort of really relate to the story. Katniss wouldn't exist if she wasn't from District 12. That informs so much of her personality and the decisions that she makes all throughout the series. And that's the kind of world building, that we're looking to create ourselves. Yes, Hufflepuff, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, lots of Ravenclaws. I'm not surprised there are a lot of Ravenclaws here, given that this is a seminar on how to world build. I think you may have guessed that I am also a Ravenclaw. Okay, so I'm just putting another little poll here. But if you want to give me an example in the chat of worlds that you really like and why, then I will also sort of call them out during the seminar. I think that some of the things that they have in common are that readers can operate in that world, because that there are 12 districts or 13 districts, how many houses are, what their characteristics are. And even when it's something unbelievable, like Voldemort and the Death Eaters, the world building is so rich that it makes you believe it's possible. So that is another aspect of great world building. It's also a world that you want to return to. The Shadowhunters world. Yes, that's another. And the Witchlands. Yes, Susan Menard's Witchlands is a wonderful example of world building. Very complex, and yet the magic system makes sense. The different kinds of threads and the different kinds of magics that the different witches have. That's a great example. Somebody says that they're a Ravenclaw, but their kids think they're a Slytherin. Fair. The Priory of the Orange Tree is another great example. Tortle, yes, Tamara Pierce and Alana, the First Adventure is really what got me into reading and fantasy all the way back far too long ago. So you can see, I think, is all coming up live. Like, people are shouting out different worlds because they work for them, and the main characteristics of the worlds working for them are: readers can operate in that world, it's believable even when it's unbelievable, and you'd want to return to that world even when it's harrowing, even when you're fighting to the death in the Hunger Games, even when you're fighting Voldemort, you get because the world building was comprehensive enough, and we got attached, and we also wanted her, at least I wanted her, to be Queen of the North for quite a long time. So let me know, do you have any questions about that so far? Oh yeah, Dune is another example of very complex world building that's very engaging. Okay. So I'm going to publish another little poll here. So now let's talk about some worlds that don't work. Yes, everybody knows that the Battle of Culloden is where Claire Randall thought that Jamie Fraser was left for dead. And so great world building, especially if it's a secondary world or if it's time travel kind of sci-fi, it also teaches you about history. Because historical novels have to be sort of approached in the same way as fantasy and sci-fi, because people don't know all the rules and the customs of that time period necessarily unless they're a specialist. Narnia is another great world. Can you not hear me? Can anybody else not hear me? How are we doing? Oh, okay. The majority of people can hear me, yes? Okay. Okay. So then I'm going to keep going. Let me know some worlds that you don't think work. Okay, great. People can hear me. Sorry. So one of the things that people, that world building where it runs into trouble are some glaring geographical time inconsistencies, overly complicated names and structures, worlds that are both too big and not fleshed out, random cultural, historical, technological borrowings, and fantasy races or problematic representations of people of diverse backgrounds. So, for instance, one example of like a glaring geographical time inconsistency that really bothered lots of viewers of the Game of Thrones series was the rate of travel between Jon Snow and the White Walkers, right? Because it didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And those kinds of things can really throw a reader out or a viewer out of the world. It just becomes frustrating for them. So that's something that you need to make sure that you really understand when you're creating the rules for your world, and so you don't end up with a giant sort of plot hole. Overly complicated names and structures, stuff that's just too silly or too difficult to remember. Some of my pet peeves are sci-fi novels that have names that have far too many consonants in them, because then I don't know how to pronounce it, and when I'm reading in my head, I'm stumbling over it. And I don't know if any of you have also run into that kind of problem. So let me know in the chat if there are any worlds that haven't really sort of worked for you. And I'm just published a poll about possible reasons for this. So the magic system didn't make sense. There was too much jargon, problematic representation. I didn't know where people were going to or from, or all of the above. Yeah, 100% all of the above. So when world building goes wrong, these are all the things that kind of go wrong, at the basic level. I think that it's also important to remember that cliches are not a shortcut to world building. So, any piece of writing is the product of the culture in which it's produced. It's never wholly divorced from context. Therefore, it's imperative that you question your own assumptions and unconscious biases whenever you set pen to paper. And this is especially important in any kind of secondary world. Well, always, but particularly it can be glaring in secondary worlds that are very closely based to ours. And I would say that the solution for this is research, and really sort of examining why you're writing what you're writing and what you're trying to get across. I'm not seeing any messages at the moment. Perhaps you're not sending any, but if you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, so then we're going to move on to what I call big to little world building. And this is how I approach world building. There are a lot of different ways that you can do it, of course. but this is how I do it. So this is the map for my world of Sweet Black Waves. And I'm going to talk about Sweet Black Waves mostly because with the Tesla legacy, which I describe as if Bruce Banner were a high school girl. Oh, okay, fine. I got some chat. I think there might have been a little bit of a delay. So questions are, what do you think about foreign names? And how early in a book should you set out the geography of the world? Well, Kevin, we are getting onto that right now. You read my mind. So that's why I've started with the map. And Sarah, about foreign names, I'm going to answer that as part of this presentation as well, because I'm a super nerd from way back. My PhD was in medieval languages and literature, so I have all kinds of medieval names in my Sweet Black Waves world, and I love it. But I also had to make sure that it always serves the story. And that is, I guess, one of the key points I want to bring home throughout this seminar is that the world building should always serve the story. Anything that is unnecessary or overly complicates it doesn't need to be on the page. So in big to little world building, that does mean starting with the geography of the world. So I started with this map, which I decided, so in the Sweet Black Waves world, it's based, a secondary world that is based on just post-Roman Britain, sort of around the sort of 5th, 6th century. And you can see that the island of Albion is a slightly skewed version of Great Britain, and the island of Iveru is a version of Ireland. Now, the reason that I decided to make a secondary world is because the legend of Tristan and Isolde, which we all know, love potion, things go wrong, kingdoms torn apart, it has been around since the early Irish versions in the sort of 7th, 8th century, but probably even earlier in the oral tradition. And so that is something that was then brought to France and the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, if you've heard of the troubadours, and it was really became popular in the 13th century. And so you have a disparate, you have a disconnect in medieval literature, especially Arthurian literature, which is my area of expertise, between King Arthur and his knights and the Tristan and Isolde legends were supposed to be taking place in the 5th, 6th century, but they're written in the 13th century, and so they're written with the sort of cultural structures and values and politics of the 13th century. So in order to have my cake and eat it too, I put it in a secondary world. William's asking if I made the map. So I didn't make this beautiful map. That is an artist, Virginia Allen. But I did, my husband, because he used to be a dungeon master in high school, he drew the original map of it that I used to create the world. And I would definitely recommend that you start with a map so that you know how long it takes to get places. There are lots of websites where you can look up like how long a horse will take to travel a certain distance, depending on how many riders, how much equipment it's carrying, that kind of thing. So with the map, that leads us to the topography and how topography shapes society. And so in the world of Sweet Black Waves, I decided, obviously you have 2 island kingdoms, and the fact that Iveru, which is the home of my protagonist Branwen, is open to attack from all sides. And in fact, one of the central drivers of the plot is this war that's been going on for generations between the kingdom of Iveru and the kingdom of Cerniv, which you can see is a sort of southwestern peninsula, and is based on Cornwall, and that's the position of Cornwall in reality. And so you have the sea all around Iveru, and they're getting attacked all the time by the kingdom of Cerniv because of their geography. Another important feature, you can sort of see, hopefully, that I've named different rivers. I've put the castles and like the primary landmarks that are talked about in the book. And also it's sort of meant to show that it's quite a hilly area, and that's because the land is so essential to the politics and the religion of the kingdom of my heroine, Branwen. So the geography leads to the economy. You can see if it's an island kingdom, that you have agriculture, you probably have fishing, you might have trade. You see a little ship going off there into the Sea of the Dead. And then on the other side of the Sea of the Dead, you have Cerniv, which we learn in book 2, Wild Savage Stars, is a former tin, or well, what I call white lead, but a tin mining sort of powerhouse. And in book 2, it's starting to decline, and that financial problem is one of the key underpinnings to why the kingdom is becoming unstable. So that is another another example of the geography leading to the economy. And then with the religion, being by the sea, gods of the sea feature into both the cultures of Cerniv and Ivaru, as well as the main goddess of Ivaru is the goddess Eru, who is the sort of literal embodiment of the land. And that's why the hills and the forests and the sort of entrances to the other world are so important. And then the religion and economy sort of combines into the politics. So in Sweet Black Waves, the kingdom is one where a king or where a queen cannot rule in her own right, where she needs to have a husband. And so that sets up another central conflict of the series, which is that Princess Isolde is the sole heir to Ivaru. She's a woman, so she can't inherit. So her parents, convene this champions tournament to find her a husband, and Prince Tristan comes over from Cerniv to win her on behalf of his uncle, King Mark. And as we know, things don't really go to plan. And so then you have the geography. The geography leads to the economy, religion, the politics, and then that all kind of combines into the history of whatever world you're creating. And ask me any more questions. So Myra asked, do you create a world Bible as you go, or do you do it in advance while plotting? So all of this big little world building that I'm talking about, I do in advance. But of course, as I'm going, I'll get inspired, or I'll think of something new, and then I'll try to see if it can fit into my overall structure. In the Sweet Black Waves world, the history is important. Because you have the Aquilan Empire, which is my version of the Roman Empire, which has retreated, which has set lots of the politics and wars into motion. The Aquilan Empire, I also say, never conquered Ivaru, because in reality, the Roman Empire never conquered Ireland, but it did conquer Cerniv. And therefore, the Aquilan culture has really affected the language and the culture and the politics and the religion of Cerniv in a way that it hasn't for Ivaru. So all of these things serve to advance the story. Monica asks, did your world enhance the plot, or did the plot enhance the world, or both? And I think I would have to say both. But for me, because I'm quite a structural thinker, I have to start with the world first. So just to sum up, the key building blocks are geography, economy, religion, politics, and history. That will be on a little handy dandy handout that I will post at the end of the session that you can download. And that's my main character, Branwen. Not you without me, not me without you, is the sort of tagline of the series, and I actually stole it from the old French poem by Marie de France about Tristan and Isolde, ne vous jamais n'aimez sans vous. And so that's always fun, because I'm a super nerd, to take things, bits from history and or other versions if you're doing a retelling, and sort of slot them in. I think to answer Monica's question also, because I was doing a retelling with this, the world was sort of set up for me, or at least the major key points of the plot. And so what I did is I went back and I looked at all the different medieval versions, from the German that inspired the Wagnerian operas that you might know, Tristan and Isolde from Mostly Now, to the original French and even the old Irish and Welsh antecedents. And then I laid it out sort of like a loom, and looked at the most repeating episodes from each of the different versions to see what were the things that made the Tristan and Isolde legend that readers would be expecting, but then taking it and putting it from Branwen's point of view, because she's the heroine of my story. She's the lady's maid. She's usually shunted to the side and not given a whole lot not given a lot of screen time, but it's actually her fault that the lovers take the love potion, so she's kind of important. Okay, so characteristics of a well-realized setting. I'm stealing this from Jeff Vandermeer, who is a wonderful writer, and he's also written this handbook to world building called Wonder Book that I would really recommend. And I will get to Kevin's question in a second. And so he says that characteristics of a well-realized setting exhibits a clear and consistent logic. The setting has built-in wider cause and effect, good and strategic uses of specific details, and the setting impacts the characters' lives in surprising and interesting ways. So in my world, Branwen, my heroine, finds an unconscious Tristan on the beach. He's just washed ashore after a pirate attack right at the beginning of the novel. Obviously, if it wasn't coastal, she wouldn't have found him, and then none of the plot ever would have happened. So it's important that all of the details that you use drive the plot forward and affect the characters. If there's a certain kind of elixir that people take, like, milk of the poppy they use a lot in Game of Thrones, it should have a plot purpose. There should be a reason why that's important, and somebody takes it to knock somebody else out so they can commit a crime or something like that. So Kevin says, I use a scene with a king leafing through a history book to explain some of the key historical events of my continent. Is that too cheesy as a device? No, I think you have to use that kind of thing sparingly, because what you want to avoid with world building is an info dump. That's kind of like the opposite of what I'm trying to talk about here, where you feed it in little by little. And to be more specific, I would say usually within the first 50 pages of your novel, you need to introduce the key elements that the reader needs to know so they can operate in that world. So you need to know the basic geography, the basic economy, at least as it pertains to your protagonists, the religion, the politics, and the history. And I love history because I love reading academic history books. And so, I like that device. Sometimes if it's, finding maybe it's a lost document that's suddenly found and it gives information about a curse or a prophecy or something that people didn't know. I think you don't want to just have a character reading a history book, but if it's somebody who is using it to find out something that they didn't know before, then that can be effective. And okay, now the next slide. So this is, you asked me if I made the map, and I said, no, my husband made the map. So this is the bigger map of the Sweet Black Waves universe. And you can sort of see in the middle towards my left, the outline of the island of Albion and Kerniv and Ivaru. And you can see that it's a much smaller part of a much bigger world. And at the Champions tournament, for instance, in Sweet Black Waves, where we have all kinds of people come from different kingdoms to try and win the Princess Isolde, I know where each of them comes from, and they're all on this map. And you can see that I've put little mountains, different places, and I have a really good idea of what's basically happening. The Aquilan Empire, my version of the Roman Empire, has started to retreat and get smaller and smaller, and that's freed up other kingdoms to now want their own trade deals, infighting among the nobles to see who's going to be king of that new kingdom now that they don't have an emperor as the overlord. So even though most of this doesn't appear, other than explaining by name that there's a Rakier Islander that almost kills one of the secondary characters, and I describe him as having long blonde hair, and he's obviously my sort of version of a Viking, because Rakier is an old version for a part of the word of Reykjavik, so that's meant to be Iceland, basically. So all of that is important for you to know as the author. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that the reader knows every little kingdom that's there, because that would take a long time. And Sarah asks, are conversations between characters a good way to introduce past events? Yeah, they are, for sure. Again, it's all a matter of a little bit here, a little bit there, having it sprinkled, and not just having it be, two people sitting at a tavern, at a way station, discussing for 5 pages what's led each of them there. You want to sprinkle it out, so that the reader is getting little bits of the information that you need them to have to operate in the world, but not all at once. Because, like anybody, if you give people too much information at once, they won't remember it, which I guess is ironically, one of the pitfalls of the webinar. But, you want them to just have it a little bit here, a little bit there. You could have a couple conversations spread out. You could also have them leafing through a history book. You want to try all of these different methods and tropes, so that the reader gets a full picture of your world without realizing it, and they're just sort of naturally digesting it. And then another important part of those conversations is to create rules for your world. So again, I'm cribbing off Orson Scott Card of Ender's Game fame here, where he says that because speculative fiction always differs from the knowable world, the reader is uncertain about what can and can't happen until the writer has spelled out the world. And you as a writer can't be certain of anything until you know the rules as well. So I think Myra asked earlier about a Bible. And so I definitely have a list, say for my magic system, which in Sweet Black Waves world is based somewhat loosely on Celtic mythology and also Celtic folklore. I looked at that and I decided which bits of that would be useful for my narrative. Obviously, in Celtic mythology, you have a whole pantheon of gods that would be way too confusing and not necessary for my plot. I basically have sort of 2 or 3 main gods that interact with my heroine and that shape the destiny that my characters have to live. Anna asks, do you write the rules out of your world in advance as well? And I do, and it's something that I've learned to do even more as I've been, writing professionally for the last sort of, 5 years, I guess, since my book started being published. And that is something that I think is a real time saver as an author, especially when you're on deadline, because you have less and less time to write usually as these things progress. So somebody asked, in my book, the reader and characters are discovering the world at the same time. Have you seen examples of this before? Yes, actually. I'm going to get to that with another slide in a minute, but for sure, my character Branwen, at the beginning of Sweet Black Waves, she's very skeptical about all of the magic and the other world and the old ones, which is sort of my version of the sort of Celtic fae lore. She's not really at all sure that they exist because her parents were murdered by Kernavak raiders when she was 6 years old, and she sort of thinks that if the gods were really protecting Ivaru, that they would have stopped her parents from getting murdered. But then, of course, there's an inciting incident where she discovers Tristan and she brings him back to life, and it seems like he's being protected by an otherworld fox. And slowly but surely, she can't deny the sort of healing magic that she has inside of her. So she is discovering more about her powers and confronting the sort of magic system, religion of her world that she's never really bought that into, as the reader is discovering it with her. So that can be a good device. Now, N.K. Jemisin, another master world builder, she has advice for us to not fear the iceberg. And what she means by that is that, like my big Sweet Black Waves universe map, you need to know a lot more than you'll ever show. And just by knowing it, it will come through in little details about, say, a certain kind of food that they might have at a certain kind of festival, or a certain kind of berry that's collected, a certain kind of music that's played at only at a funeral, perhaps. All those little details are what make worlds so rich and make you really believe that they're real. And you don't need to, to go over the top with specific details all the time, because that will also get tiresome. But just little hints here or there are what, I always think of it sort of like a Christmas tree, where you're hanging ornaments and you need to have them, well spaced out so that the Christmas tree looks balanced. And a little bit goes a long way. Don't want it completely covered with tinsel. I'm sort of beating that metaphor to death. But anyway, you don't fear the iceberg. And then that relates to Jeff Vandermeer's advice as well. You think of, Alice in Wonderland. It has its own consistent logic, which is like totally out there. But what's happening when Alice eats the thing, becomes big and becomes small and that kind of thing. You also have the wider cause and effect. A great example of that is Marie Rutowski's The Winner's Curse, which is a secondary world based vaguely on the Romans taking over the Greek Empire, and her world building. The different castes affects the two protagonists who are enemies but become lovers. Good and strategic uses of specific details, like he talks about, are those things that N.K. Jemisin is talking about in this slide, which is that, you have all these little things below the surface, and then you occasionally bring them out to construct your world. I think that one of my favorite series is Robin Lefebvre's His Fair Assassin series, which is sort of assassin nuns in medieval Brittany. And there, if you are blessed by the god Mortain of death to be one of his handmaidens, you see a mark of death on people who are meant to be your victims. And like just little details like that really make the story. So let me see if anybody else has any questions. Please ask. Okay. I'm just putting up the Wild Savage Stars link, which is my latest offering. So worldview versus story view. This goes back to the question about the protagonist discovering the world along with the reader. So again, from Jeff Vandermeer, you have the worldview, which is what you as the writer knows. And it establishes the wider context and may contain more stories than just the one you're currently focused on. Obviously, with fantasy, you can have many volumes of works happening to different characters in the same universe at different time periods. It can go on and on. That's, if a world is rich enough to support more than one character's story, that's an example of good world building. And then you have the story view, which is what the characters know and believe about that world. And, and so that can really be used to create dramatic effect by having different characters know different things. I think it was Kevin was asking about going through a history book. So, one person might know what's in that history book and the other person doesn't. And then does that drive the conflict between them? Or is somebody trying to keep that history book hidden because they don't want the person to find out what's in it? And obviously characters have conflicts, and they might come from different parts of the world, and they might have versions of a story or different kinds of religion that conflict. So not every character needs to know everything that you know as the author, and that is actually, can often be a source of driving the plot. So let me know if you have any more questions. Now I'm saying let's build a world. So we have about 20 minutes left where you can ask me lots of different questions about world building. And I'm just going to start off the conversation. And this is a group task that when I do this in the seminar in person, I would divide you into 5 groups and assign you to think about the politics, religion, the economy, the geography, or the history of this world, this sort of story, skeleton story that I'm giving you. And this is part of the handout, and I'm just going to share that now. let me know if you can see it. And if you are having trouble downloading it for some reason, then just email me on the website on my KristinaPerez.com. There's a get in touch page, and you can email me, and I will send you the PDF. So here's a world that we haven't seen before. So your brilliant idea is you want to write about a princess. She's 12. She sees her whole family die when their spaceship blows up on the day of her father's coronation. She escaped, saved by an old family retainer. He takes her to a planet inhabited only by nuns to hide until she reaches the age of succession. Meanwhile, the imperial family's assassination has been pinned on a low-class boy from a mining colony that supplies the mineral that fuels the starships. The mine is owned by the imperial family's rival dynasty, who keep their workers in slave-like conditions. The boy goes on the run and discovers that the princess that only witnessed what really happened is still alive. Together, they'll discover who killed her family, and the truth is more complicated than either of them could ever have imagined. This group task, if you if you have a writing group wherever you are in Sweden, Edinburgh, all around the world, then you could take this handout and work on it together. Or you can just do it as a writing exercise for yourself. So the politics are obviously first and foremost at the forefront of this story, because you have an imperial family that's assassinated. So you're like, who is trying to assassinate them? Was it the rival dynasty, or was it somebody else? That's the central conflict. So then you think about, okay, these two different dynasties, how are they different? Why do they hate each other? What is it that they're rivals about? Is it the mining colony? Is it the mineral for the starships? Are they running out of minerals? Is that what the fight is about? Is this a resource war? That kind of thing. The religion. So we're told in the story summary that the princess is taken to a planet inhabited only by nuns. Why nuns? What kind of nuns? Who do they worship? What gods are involved? Why would they protect her? So that you bring the religion into it. The economy, obviously, we already know that there's some mining going on, that there's some slaves, that there's probably discontent, maybe an uprising in the works, sort of Red Rising style. The geography, obviously, in space, it's a little bit different and spread out, but then you think about what are the different atmospheres of the different planets, or some planets too cold or some uninhabitable. What do they have? How are they trading with each other? All kind of Battlestar Galactica, Star Trek type things. And then the history, like what is the history of this galaxy? How do all those things come together to feed into the story that you're trying to write? So here I'm putting the cart a little bit before the horse, and asking you to sort of reverse engineer the world for the story, which I know is what I've told you the opposite to do throughout this webinar, but I think it's a good intellectual exercise to play with that and to try to reverse engineer something that would make sense, that this story could play out on, and your reader would be engaged and be compelled and rooting for the boy who has been falsely accused of murder, and the princess who has been disinherited and has lost her family. You want them to win, and so you need a world that sets up everything for them to play out their story. So Kevin says, I have story threads running in 5 or 6 different parts of my continent. They are drawn together as the book progresses. Is that too many characters or threads? It depends. I'm guessing that you're maybe writing sort of adult fantasy where multiple POVs are the norm, and that's definitely part of the convention of the genre. But I would say that you need to think about, are all those POVs really necessary? And if they are, how do you introduce them in a sort of a logical, coherent manner so that the reader isn't too confused, doesn't get too much whiplash between 6 different parts of a continent, 6 different kingdoms, 6 different religious systems. I only introduce the world building necessary for each of those parts of your continent to further your plot. And I also think you need to, this is slightly more of a plotting pacing issue than a world building issue, but I think that you need to have some of the characters start to converge, fairly early on. Otherwise, the reader just gets lost in too many disparate stories without seeing how they interconnect. If you take an example of your standard adult fantasy novel is about 125,000 words, I would say that within the first 20,000 words, which is about 100 pages printed, that you need to have a couple of the storylines intersect, even if they don't know it. I mean, maybe you have two characters. Again, I'm talking about this tavern and way station. I don't know why I'm sort of obsessed with that. That they happen to be at the tavern when a murder takes place, and they each get a different perspective on it, and they each have been at the tavern for the wrong reason or different reasons, and they both leave, and that like furthers their adventure story. And maybe later on in the plot you discover that they were both there at the same time, if that makes sense. So yes, pick my brain. That is the Tesla Legacy, and then the Myth of Morgan Le Fay is my academic monograph. My PhD was on Morgan Le Fay, tracing her origins from a Celtic sovereignty goddess to today. She's pretty awesome. She gets a bad rap, essentially. So are there any other questions? Yes, I see. Celeste says, I'm about to start the second book of a 3-part fantasy. I didn't fully address these 5 parts. How can I approach filling in the approach filling in the gaps in book 2 without being obvious? That's tricky, and but we've all had to do it, because even with all the best of intentions in my 5 building blocks, sometimes you think of some element that's key to the plot that you didn't mention in the first book. So I would say, again, that you want to sort of thread it in little by little. Yes, Morgana is pretty awesome. Thanks, Beth. So I think that if it's a religious, I don't know what your example is, but for instance, if it's a religious element or a god or goddess that is suddenly going to be important to your character, I think that you could say that they didn't believe in that god or goddess, or for some reason they hadn't had contact with it. There are ways, there are get outs that you can do that. And I missed a question earlier. It was about about religion. Cullum asked, does religion need to be some type of worshiping religion, or can there be other forms of religion? Sure. It's really the limit is your imagination. If it could be maybe some kind of animism, like a more like Shinto type religion. It could even you could have a like in the culture, in Ian M. Banks' culture series, there isn't really religion per se, but you have the sort of AI that are practically gods. And so the way they do things, what people think about them, that is a sort of a form of religion or a philosophy. So I think that, you can definitely do whatever makes sense for your world. It could be a world in which religion had been banned for some reason. And Anna's asked, would you say there's a big difference between world building for YA fantasy and adult fantasy? I think to a certain extent, yes, just because of the expectations of the readers. I would say that you can still approach it in this sort of basic way, with the geography, economy, religion, politics, history. But how elaborate and complicated it needs to be will vary. And I think you also need to think about the word count, which takes me back to sort of Kevin's question. He said that he's on for about 140,000, 150,000. Should I be looking to chop? or have faith that people will stick with it. So I would say that, of course, adult fantasy, you do have a bit of a tradition of the doorstops, but it really has to support it. Putting my agent hat on now for a minute, with a debut writer, if I get a query that, is like 150,000 word fantasy, I don't know that, you have the chops to pull that off, because that's a lot of plot, a lot of words, a lot of world building to get through, and I might worry that you've just sort of thrown the kitchen sink at it. It depends on the pitch, obviously, and if I read your sample pages, what I think about the writing and whether it resonates with me. But it's a lot of work to ask an agent to do and to ask an editor to do. So I guess I would just say that I would really think about how much is needed. And generally, I think, and this is the case for me as well, because I tend to write long. My most of my YA novels, by the time I was finished writing them, they were at around 120,000. And then I worked with my editor to get them down to more around like 105. So, YA fantasy is generally, somewhere, there are exceptions, of course, but generally you're looking at somewhere between, 95 and 100 or 110, really at the outside. And so when you think of how I approach writing my novels from a plotting and pacing point of view, is I tend to try to think of writing 90,000 words in 30 chapters of 3,000 words, just because it's an easy mathematical framework. I'm not great at math. And it's a way to start structuring your novels. Obviously I do chapter outlines, because I'm very methodical with everything that I do. Oh yes, Myra. So I will be doing an Ask Agent session with Myra Cuevas, who's another wonderful writer in Las Musas, and in May, where we can ask more agent questions, although I am happy to answer some now. So I think that what I would say is that YA fantasy, because it's shorter, and also tends to be a little bit more action driven, although not always. Mine is actually, I think, more character driven and a little bit slower than some of the other YA fantasies, which, not all readers are into. So it's also about what readers' expectations are. So I think that what I would say is that for YA fantasy, you need to make sure that the world building always serves the plot, and that you don't kind of go off on tangents. Susan Dennard's Witchland series is a really great example of complicated world building, in that it's elaborate, but she does such a great job of being very clear and making it easily intelligible right from the beginning, that you're totally there with the characters as they discover their different witch talents, and you're not stopping to think too much about the world building. It's just naturally being brought into the plot and incorporated, and sort of driving the plot of the different political conflicts in the series. So I think you can still approach it in the same way, but you definitely want perhaps slightly lighter. Well, that's not fair. I think you just need to make sure that everything is introduced for a reason in YA, and I think the YA audience has a less tolerance for sort of doing like a deep dive of having like a bard in a tavern, going on for 3 pages with a song about a battle that was won and lost several generations ago, sort of Lord of the Rings style. I mean, I happen to love those, and I actually had a lot more of Tristan in my books, singing to Branwen and recounting sort of old Irish legends to her in the cave at the beginning of Sweet Black Waves, that my editor was like, yeah, no, nobody cares. So, this has been a learning process for me over the last few years as well, with having my world building sort of cut down when I was maybe a bit self-indulgent. I think that's, the phrase, kill your darlings. It's definitely true for favorite pet phrases and sentences in your prose, but it's also true for bits of world building. Beth says you do care. Well, maybe I'll do some bonus content and I'll reveal the deleted ballads that Tristan sent. Oh, Emily cares too. All right, guys are giving me some ideas. Maybe I'll put them on my website or something. But having said that, ballads can be an effective way of getting information across if you keep them short. So let's see, we've got about slightly less than 5 minutes left. So I guess I have to sort of pitch the conclusion to Sweet Black Waves trilogy, which is Bright Wave and Skies, which is coming out August 25th, as far as I'm aware, unless the pandemic interferes, but it should be on shelves, or at least virtual shelves. And it's the conclusion to Branwen's story. And I won't give anything away. I will say that I took the legend as you know it, and it still sort of seems like as you know it, except that I've made a twist. And so, that's another fun thing to do with retellings, if any of you are working on retellings. Somebody says, do you have a template you use or recommend for world building? Well, so Jeff Vandermeer's book, Wonder Book, is really great, and it's got wonderful illustrations as well. And you can definitely look at that as a reference text. And the handout that I put there, just a sort of summary of what we've done. I'm trying to think of also the Orson Scott Card book as well. I think that it's, to a certain extent, it's a try, do by trying. So is that twist that our poor beloved Branwen gets a happy ending because my soul is a broken, shattered mess? I can't make any promises. I can't really spoil anything. But let's just say that she really comes into her own in the third book, and I think that it will be a satisfying conclusion. Has the ending changed since you started writing the first book? Actually, no. So I'm one of those writers who has to know how a story ends before I can begin it. So I've known from the beginning of the series exactly what the last scene of the third book was going to be, exactly where Branwen had to get in her life and in all the political upheavals of the kingdoms and her journey with her magic. Which has obviously gone a bit dark by the end of book 2. So for me, that's an important sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Like, I always need to know where I'm trying to get my character to, and all of the world building, is set up to get my character to that point, or multiple, if you have multiple POVs, multiple characters. I would suggest, because I am an intense plotter and I am always amazed by pantsers. I just don't think that way. I can't do it. So, I would always suggest, if you're writing a series, and of course little things will change, but that you, peg the main plot points. I usually use a big piece of construction paper, and I'd like to write a timeline. So that's one way you can approach it, because I'm kind of a Luddite, and I still handwrite all of my first drafts of my books by hand, in notebooks. So my handwriting's terrible, so nobody else can read it besides me. But that's just the way my brain works, is by sort of, physically writing things. And so, yes, if you're doing the math, I have sort of handwritten about 350,000 words of the Sweet Black Waves trilogy in notebooks in my bookshelf behind me. And so Kevin asks, you mentioned writing 30 chapters of 3,000 words. Do you always have an idea of the chapter length, or do I allow myself some latitude? Oh, Beth's another handwriter. Yay for handwriters. So of course, 3,000 words is just a sort of a guideline. I sort of discovered that as I was starting to get serious about writing, you know, about maybe sort of 12 years ago or so. And I was just writing lots and lots of manuscripts that you'll never see the light of day. But I started realizing that most of my chapters were kind of clocking out like around 3,000, 3,500 words. Yes, Emily says handwriters unite. And you know, and also looking, if you look at published books, that's about 15 pages. And you know, very often a chapter will be sort of 15 to 20 pages. You know, there are exceptions, of course, like Alice Hoffman, Practical Magic is one of my favorite books, and she doesn't really use chapters at all. She just has lots of sort of, you know, asterisk sort of subdividing sections. And you know, and she's a masterful writer, so it works. You know, I tend to think about chapters in a sort of solid form. And also I think that it depends on the kinds of genre you're writing in. You know, if you're writing a thriller, for instance, people expect sort of short chapters, you know, that the pacing keeps going all the time, that you know, you always have to turn the page, you never let up, you know, and they tend to be shorter. So you know, I think that you know, 3,000 words is a good guideline, but of course there are always exceptions. Everything in writing is always an exception. You know, I think that there's no one way to approach anything. This just happens to be sort of my way that's worked for me, and that I've sort of figured out over the last sort of decade or so. So, okay, I think the file is up. If you've had a hard time accessing it for any reason, then do please email me. And it's just about to go 6 o'clock or 1 p.m. in the Eastern time. I'm here in London, Friday night, TGIF. Are there any final questions before you go on to do whatever you're doing in your part of the world? Oh, Monica, thank you. I'm so glad that you guys could join me, even in this slightly bizarre time that we're all living through. And I'm already seeing sort of pandemic novels coming into my submissions box. Oh, Kevin, great. I'm so glad that it's been useful for you. So yeah, I hope that maybe I will see some of your queries in my submissions inbox at some point. And thank you guys for joining me. All right, I will, I'm going to end the webinar now, but it will be posted on Las Musas webinar page. So you can rewatch it, I think, on YouTube if you, you know, if you missed anything that I was saying. And also I will be back with Myra for Ask Agent May 29th. And who's better than the quarantine quiz? Excellent. And there are also one other wonderful webinars being hosted by all of my fellow Musas all throughout the next few months. So please sign up for them as well. Oh, good. I'm glad you guys will do the exercise. And, you know, please tweet me, KK Perez Books or K Perez Agent, and let me know how your exercises have gone. And also do please pre-order Bright Raven Skies. Okay, bye-bye.